Welcome to episode 283, in which we discuss a new podcast, Wonder Women of Aviation, with host Natalia McAlee. Hey, before we begin, a shout out to our sponsor, the Spartan College of Aeronautics and Technology. Please visit them at spartan.edu. You can find out more about their giveaway. They're giving away 50 scholarships guides. That's that scholarships guide we have with over $120 million in scholarships. You can find out more by going to stuckmicadcast.com/free. Use the coupon code Spartan. Thanks so much, Spartan. Find them at spartan.edu. Let's move on to the cruise flight. The Wonder Women of Aviation is a podcast that helps preserve the history of women in aviation and highlights women involved in all aspects of aviation. Each episode, Natalia interviews women both in and out of the cockpit to talk about their passions, experiences, the history of aviation, and how they make an impact. Joining us today is the host of that podcast, Natalia McAlee. Welcome to the show, Natalia.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for having me. It's odd being on the other side.
See, and it's great to have you. We have done so much together as far as air shows and through that circuit. We'll talk about that later. But first of all, I do want to say hats off to you. Please go out and check out her podcast, The Wonder Women of Aviation, and it's awesome, absolutely awesome podcast. But first, before we talk about that, you're no stranger to aviation. So let's talk a little bit about your journey and how it's evolved, because you have a varied background in aviation.
I do. Yeah. So, my mom and dad, my mom actually started working for an airline. And that's something that I was exposed to as a child. I was always kind of, just curious about aircraft, and we would go live the non-rev life. We would just jump on airplanes at a whim's notice. So I was always intrigued by aviation. So I knew I wanted to get into it. And I started, as soon as I turned 18, I became a customer service agent for that said airline. And that's something that just kind of grew and evolved, because the more I learned, the more I grew, and the more I wanted to be a part of something. So I worked for that airline for about maybe 15 years, but I wanted more. I knew that, okay, I know the customer service side of the house. I want to learn how things work. So I started working for another regional airline where I learned more of the auditing and safety aspect of it. So I would, go out in the field, just audit aircraft, making sure that everything was in compliance. So I learned the compliance side of the house. I wanted more after that. So I started to work for the Department of Aviation, where I basically learned all of O'Hare's runways. I was emergency response. When it came down to just opening and closing runways, I issued a lot of the closures, the runway closures. So that was a big part of my life that I absolutely loved. But I also missed airplanes and interacting with people. So I went back to an airline. I'm currently working for a legacy airline. I've been here for 3 years as a customer service supervisor, which I absolutely love. So, it's been part of my life. I was counting the other day, and probably for over 20 years, I've been in the airline industry. So, it's like, and I didn't study it. It just kind of, like everyone says, you got bit by the bug. That was exactly what happened to me. I was always intrigued, and I'm like, I want more.
Absolutely. And we all understand that bug. And now, as you can hear in the background, you guys are working hard. Right now, you're at work. You're between shifts, or between, as they call banks. Banks is the word I should have used. But it's really a dynamic and exciting environment. And you see so much during the day, which I think is really cool. Another cool thing is that I think you represent women in aviation in a great way, in that you're a great example in the fact that you've actually done so many things in aviation. And that's the reason we're here today. I want to talk a lot about that, because I think there's more people that should be like yourself, and they're getting there, that get out there and show people, hey, you can do it. You're just like me. You can do it if I can do it. So then you started, I guess, this podcast. You have this incredible background in aviation, and you started this podcast, and it's called the Wonder Women of Aviation. Is that correct?
Yes, it is called the Wonder Women of Aviation.
And so tell us a little bit about why. Why did you start this podcast? And then tell us a little bit about what it is.
Okay. So I started it mainly to learn more about, so my husband is an airshow pilot. His name is Patrick McAlee, which you know. And I kind of got married into the different side of the house, which was the aerobatics, the GA, the I call it the exciting part of aviation. But I found myself lost and confused. I'm like, okay, I know aviation, but this was a whole different world for me. So when I stepped into that world, I started to ask more questions. My background is in journalism, and I innately am always wanting to learn and ask more. So when I started to attend air shows and I started to meet all these cool individuals, I wanted to learn more about their story, but more so the women that are involved behind the scenes. We tend to forget that there's more to aviation than just flying or becoming, a flight attendant or a pilot. There's different aspects that, like myself, people on the ground that make it happen. So I started the podcast recently just as a way to learn more about the different women, individuals involved in aviation. So I started to just pick my husband's brain and like, tell me your story. Tell me about the women that influenced you, inspired you, and I'm going to go after them and chase them and learn more. So that's kind of a little bit of how it started.
Wow. And what's interesting is that, and you've had such a key role in aviation. I think a lot of times when like someone's introduced to you, they think about your husband, right, in the air show circuit. And you've had this incredible career in aviation, and hats off to you. And that's something that I love about your podcast is you bring to the fore a lot of different careers that people don't think about. In our sister podcast, Aviation Careers Podcast, of course, we talk about that often, about all different careers. And that is something I truly love. And I truly love the fact that by doing this, you're making it a little more inclusive. And that's something that we're trying to do more and more in life in general, especially in aviation. I know on the pilot side, you talked about pilots, flight attendants, and the pilot side is very few women in the aviation world. I don't know the stats on, say, other than flight attendants in the fields that you're in, as far as like at airport operations and that type of thing. I was wondering, maybe you could give us a little color there, maybe just through your own experiences if you don't know the numbers.
Yeah, I have to research the stats. It's actually something I've been wanting to research. But for in the previous department I worked for, it was just, I think for every 10 men that worked in the department, there was just 2 females. So it was a pretty low percentage in the airport ops. When it comes down to my current employer, we do have a lot of women in strong roles. It's from the ops perspective, I think we're growing and we're promoting that. But there's obviously more room for growth, right? So I see the shift and the change. We're not where we need to be, but it's growing. And that's one thing that I want to get out there, that there are more roles that if you're not the type of person, I want to learn to fly, but I mean, it's going to take a while and I'm definitely afraid of flying. But there's other things that you can do if you're passionate about aviation that if you're not exposed to it, you're not aware of these jobs.
Yeah, one of those I think is really cool that people don't think about, you've had on your podcast, is wing walker. And it's like people don't realize that's a thing. And you just go to the air shows and you see that. I have a lot of friends and have met so many wing walkers, and what an incredible story that was. And one of the things I think people will find out by listening to that episode is the incredible amount of work that goes into it. And it's not just getting out there on the wing and walking. There's more to it, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when she started to talk about the physical aspect, the mental aspect of it, there's so many components, the training that's involved behind it. Like you look at it, you look in the sky, you're like, okay, this is amazing. But again, being the journalist that I am, I'm just like, okay, what is involved? And when I heard Kelly Garvin is the interview that I had, I was just in awe, and she inspired me even more. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So
another person that I thought was really cool, and somebody that I really admire, is Teresa Eamon, and having her on, and that she's a period actor and singer. Actually, a little kind of trivia for me. That was actually the last thing I went to listen to, last concert I went to with my father before he passed, was with Teresa. And I tell Teresa that. I said, we both were in awe of her. And listening to her background and the challenges that she has had, just absolutely amazing. And what was inspiring is that she kept going. She didn't give up.
Yeah, and she's actually on one of my next podcasts. Our schedules have been crazy because she's been at a couple of air shows, so I can't talk on that yet. But she's definitely someone I'm going to learn more about.
She is awesome. I mean,
yeah, I think.
She just everything every interview I've ever done with her and listened to of her, she just is so upbeat, and just the fact that she's just just out there and just terrific. Then that's awesome. But I think I've seen you and Teresa out in the field. I think it was at Sun and Fun. I can't remember where you guys were talking.
Yeah.
That's probably what I'm referring to. Yeah, that was probably it that I was thinking about. But
we're usually crossing paths running.
And that's the other thing that's interesting about this industry, how small it is, isn't it? It's like you're sitting there, you're like, oh, wow, here I am at this air show. And they all become like a family, don't they?
They do. And I believe, I'm trying to think of when I first met Teresa. I think it was at ICAST, the International Council of Air Show convention that we go to every year. And I saw her, and I think it was Ricardo, and I was intrigued by her outfit. I'm like, oh my gosh, she is promoting the 40s, the 50s. I love that vintage look. That's something that I've always been enamored with. And then Ricardo is kind of like her side kick. It was just like, so I met her there and I learned more about her story. And I'm like, okay, the vintage vocals, the fact that she promotes the history of it. And that's what really, I think she was one of the women that I haven't told her yet that has inspired me to really pursue the historical aspect of aviation, which leads me into like the WASP, and we can talk about that later, but she definitely has inspired me to pursue different avenues of the historical aspect of my podcast.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the history. I mean, I think that's awesome that you're going into the historical aspect of aviation and women in aviation. I fortunately have for many years been able to interview the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASP, as you mentioned, at different air shows, especially at Sun and Fun, and you can go back and listen to those, and they're amazing people, and they're so humble, and they're humbling to me because of what they have done. And I think a lot of people, we've almost erased that part of our history, but we're writing it again. And that's what's so exciting. If you listen to their story, they're finally getting the recognition that they deserve, don't you think?
Absolutely. I think they were saying that, was it in 2009? They just recently received the congressional award. And I'm like, why did it take so long? I'm glad it happened. But that kind of, prompted more questions. Like, I didn't know who they were. I had no idea that they existed. And it's a shame because these women were such powerful moguls in the industry in the 1940s during the war that helped support the men. And I'm like, why are we, forgetting about that piece of our history? So I actually have a ton of interviews lined up with the WASP. There's actually a movie that's coming out. So I have an interview with the director, Kara White, I believe is her name. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yep, I have.
Okay. Yeah, Rise Above the Wasp is the movie. I'm like, I saw the previews. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so cool.
Yeah, I can't wait till that comes out.
Yeah. I mean, I love the fact that these women are actually promoting that piece of our history and bringing the story in a way that, you're not going to be, I mean, not that it's boring, but, just with the current age.
Right. No. And listening to their stories, I mean, what could be boring about it? And,
Right.
I'll never forget in one of my interviews, I asked one of the ladies, what she flew. And she said the multi-engine aircraft. I said, which one? All of them. I was like, really? Wow. And one of the things that I think we need to keep doing is asking those questions of these people, because those stories were put to the background, final flight, whichever way it is. There's a book out there that talks about the fight to have them actually buried in a military cemetery, and that's finally has happened, and that's actually terrific that they're doing that. It's interesting, you said something right there. You tuned in on something. The 2009 people do not understand that history because sometimes we do that. We don't want to think about some things that weren't good in our history. And, but sometimes it's best to bring it to the fore so that we can learn from it, because if we just ignore it, we're not going to learn, are we?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it just takes different individuals to tell the story in a different way, because we're constantly evolving and changing as a society. So I think maybe that's exactly what's happening right now. It's these individuals that have a different perspective and are able to tell the story in a way that we can relate. So I think it's phenomenal what they're doing. There's also an audiobook that I'm listening to. It's called, I'm trying to think of the name. It's about the WASP as well. So there's a lot of different pieces of media that are being put out there, which is great.
It is terrific. And so with that said, going through the history, I think something important is that we can get inspiration through that history. So I'm assuming, and I'll ask you this, who is it you're trying to reach with this? And we kind of hinted at it in the beginning, but specifically, why, again, we go back to the why of the podcast and who you want your audience to be.
I think generally I'm trying to reach out to individuals like myself who weren't necessarily exposed to it. Although I was exposed to aviation, I wasn't exposed to the history of aviation. So those that are outsiders looking in that may or may not be in aviation, just kind of getting it out to the general public and want to learn more about it or just haven't heard of it. So I just want to reach a new target audience that hasn't been exposed to these stories and these women or individuals in aviation. So it just can be anyone and everyone, honestly.
And I think that's terrific. I think one of the things, and I've tried to do that with our podcast and other podcasts, and somebody that I think that we at times forget about are those producers in aviation. Yes. Like you said, the producer, like Nancy Spielberg. I mean, her brother gets all the recognition, but she did that great aviation show, Above and Beyond. I mean, there are so many people out there that I really wish we could have more out there in aviation, in the world, put out there, and their names shining in lights. And that's what you're doing. I think that's great. I think that's awesome.
I think that's exactly the target I want to reach too. I actually we just did a show in Battle Creek, and Julia Dacey, I met her and she was talking about the, Dacey Air Show team. And I was like, okay, well, what do you do? And she focuses specifically on military coordination. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. You're going to be on my podcast. So it's just those, producers behind the scenes, individuals that, make something so amazing and beautiful, but like you said, they don't get that recognition. I'm an introvert believe it or not. And sometimes I want to be behind the scenes and I don't want to be seen, and I get it, but I'm going to find you.
And I'm glad you're doing that. And it's interesting you say you're behind the scenes, but out in the air show circuit, you're pretty recognizable is the best way to say it. Can we talk about that, by the way, what you do in the air show circuit with your husband, Patrick?
So absolutely. What I do is provide, we were talking about this the other day. I'm like, how can we package this in a way where people understand? So a big part of my life has been pop culture and comic books. I've always been intrigued by comic books, the stories, the superhero, the different, alter egos, because growing up I was shy and I'm still an introvert. So I'd always kind of delve into that creative world. The main character that I identify with is Wonder Woman. And what I do is cosplay. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's short term for costume play. So I cosplay at shows as a form of self-expression. And I go out in the crowd and I support after, Patrick flies, we go on the ground and we kind of walk the crowd. And I dress up as this character and just take pictures, meet with fans, help support Patrick. And like I said, just show that, love for the character, as well as, identifying with the community and connecting with the community.
And it works. And honestly, kind of one of my favorite things about that really got me interested in you, Natalia, is the pictures that I see when you're at an air show and you see this little girl looking up at you in wonderment, and she's almost projecting herself on you. And that actually kind of hits at your heartstrings, I feel.
It truly does. And I'm still taken aback. This last show that we performed at, my husband performed at, but, I was walking around in cosplay. I had two little kids, and I'm sure you've probably seen the picture. They just ran up to me and hugged me. And I'm like, what do I do? So it was just that moment, I think, was beyond magical. And then another kid had a little, toy, and he was just like playing and acting with me. And I'm like, this is what it is. This is cosplay. This is reenacting a moment, whether it's pop culture or someone you look up to, and playing into that, like, imagination. I'm all about promoting the art of just imagination and creativity. And that's exactly I'm like, we nailed it. Nailed it.
I think you did. You know, during the air show, your husband Patrick really takes things away and takes our breath away. But after the show, I think you do, and I think what the both of you do together is absolutely wonderful. And the fact that you're reaching out to so many people, so many young people—that's what really excites me, is because I think they look at you and say, "I want to be like her. I want to be like them. I can do this. I want to get out there and try, whatever it may be. It doesn't have to be aviation, whatever it is, you can do it." And I think that's one of the things I absolutely love about what you folks do and what you're doing with the podcast too. Absolutely. By the way, Patrick McAlee, you can find him out on Patrick McAlee Air Shows, I think it is, on the website.
Yeah, patrickmcaleeairshows.com. He's on Instagram. He's all over social media.
Yeah,
well, I am. I support that too.
And that's another thing, that you have so many hats. And so let's back up a little bit. I do want to talk about your career a little, as far as women are concerned. As you've come up through your career, have you seen any challenges let's talk about it from a female perspective. Has there been any challenges in your promotion to where you are throughout your career?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. Initially, when I first started, like I said, you only know females in aviation as a pilot or a flight attendant. So for me, that was a challenge in itself, because I never knew where I fit. Like, where do I truly belong? So that was hard, because it was hard to reach out to mentors in the aviation industry that would help advance my career goals. So I was constantly trying to find my way. And honestly, I found my way on my own by conducting a lot of research, pushing a lot harder. So that was one of the things that I feel like, if I had that support system, things would probably have turned out differently. But I'm happy with where I'm at in my career. But it would have probably made the process a little easier. It is a definitely male-dominated industry. And although I see the shift now, it's just a lot harder to get past certain preconceived notions of where a female belongs in the industry. You're not really heard or seen or taken seriously. So some of those challenges I had to really overcome and just kind of subside. It makes you angry. So just let that anger go and just push harder and stronger.
And I think that's an example in that industry where that happens, but it's other industries too. And so if you're somebody who's involved in, say, computer industry, that's one of those investment. I mean, this is I feel you're a great example, and your podcast is a great example to inspire other women in all different fields. This is just aviation. I mean, there's so much out there, but it's one thing we love. That's the cool thing. And if you're somebody and you're a female, listening or watching on YouTube, make sure you go out there and try and listen to Natalia and all the other people who've done this before you. I mean, you definitely are standing on the shoulders of giants through these podcasts and through these interviews, especially that you're doing that are out there. So as far as being able to listen to this podcast that you have, let's talk a little bit about that. And I think you finished up with your career there. You're here, you're doing a great job. And I commend you for everything you've done and what you're doing moving forward, because you are a good example. But let's talk about how you can find you out there on, I think it's Spotify, right?
It's on Spotify. Yeah, that's the main, platform that I'm using. It's also on Anchor. I'm trying to branch off into Apple, but I'm still learning the podcast world. But right now, mainly it is on Spotify. I do have a WordPress that I'm creating. So there's a WordPress where I'm going to involve more blogs, more stories. There's going to be 2 or 3 co-hosts that are going to be involved in it. Teresa's one of them. Kelly is another. And also Brittany Nielsen of Grant Nielsen Air Shows. But to answer your question, yeah, Spotify. It's growing.
And we'll have the links, by the way, in the show notes here at Stuck My Gavcast. You can find all that. But, you've done so many different things. And what's next? A book. I mean, I think it's a children. I just got to review it real quickly. It's a children's book. It's called The Blue Demons Flying Adventures. Yes. I think it's fairly recent that it's come out. So tell us a little bit about that. I know you can find it on Amazon. We'll have links, by the way, to that book.
Okay, so The Blue Demon Flying Adventures is basically a book about Patrick's plane, dubbed the Blue Demon, going to just different air shows and going on all these adventures. I did incorporate a lot of STEM in the book, so there's a lot of math and science and writing, so you can kind of write out the words instead of your typical apple, it's propeller. Math, it incorporates different aspects of the airplane. So it was my way of learning more about the air show world, the aerobatic world. So there's some maneuvers in there. I incorporated some arresting maneuvers, just the basics. So that way children and myself can understand the whole aerobatic side of the house. So we're on book 2. We're going to create book 3. It's currently on Amazon if you're interested. So it's an activity / coloring book / adventure book. I created it with one of my friends who's an artist here in Chicago. His name is Alero Art, and he's heavily involved in like children's after school programs as well. So he and I just started bouncing off ideas back and forth. So with his expertise and then my questions, and obviously Patrick is a big component of it as well. So he's like signs up for the final, okay, this makes sense. I think we created. Yeah, I think it's amazing. So it's great. It's turned out to be, I think people absolutely love it. So I'm like, I didn't think that would happen.
What age range about for the book?
So the ages are between 4 to 11. So it's got, the coloring book aspect of it, but it also has, learning to read, learning to write. So 4 to 11.
Awesome. Well, Natalia, this has been awesome having you here. A couple things, though, before I let you go. I want to ask you, first of all, what's next? What's next for Natalia? I mean, it's like, what could be next? You're doing so much, but I'd like to look at appear in the future because you have a lot of runway in front of you in life.
Oh my gosh, I do. What's next? So I'm definitely going to learn to fly. That's on my bucket list. I'm waiting for my husband to get his instructors. Is it CFI?
CFI, right?
I'm waiting for him to get that. So that's like on my top, but I'm going to wait a little bit longer till I understand and feel comfortable. Obviously, I'm going to continue pursuing the Blue Demon Adventures and continue writing that book. Still promoting the aviation industry with the podcast. So I have a whole slew of guests lined up, which I mentioned earlier. I'm going to talk about WASP. I'm going to talk about with, Daisy. So I'm just definitely going to continue pushing the women in aviation side of the house. There's so much more. I can't even wrap my brain around what I have going on in my life. I'm like, I'm in school, so it's a lot, but I'm excited about the future and where we are going to be as a team, and not only that, but myself.
Yeah, I'm excited for you also. My only word of advice is you shouldn't let your spouse teach you how to fly. It prevents a lot of arguments if you don't do that.
Oh, we've already been arguing.
I can imagine.
The first argument is what type of airplane we're going to get. I'm stuck on the Cub. I'm like absolutely in love with the Cub. Like I saw Greg Coons fly, and I'm like, okay, that's what I want.
That's what you want.
That's what or a Super Cub, either or.
So I think it's terrific that you've gotten into aviation as much as you have. I mean, you almost had to, but you've taken the ball and you run with it. And I think that's awesome that you've done all this, and excited to see what's next. If somebody's listening, if females are listening right now, what type of advice would you have for them, whether pursuing a career or pursuing aviation as an adventure, moving forward in their lives?
I would have to say, feel the fear and do it anyways. We're always afraid of doing something because we're afraid of failure. We're afraid of, whatever fear you have. So just accept that, feel the fear, and just do it anyway. And there's a book on it too, which I read. I'm a big advocate of reading books, but that's one thing. You never know what you'll become if you just don't try. So just do it. And I hear that a lot, but now I'm like, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to learn to fly. I'm just going to take this course or whatever it may be. I'm going to go after this job. Just do it, because the worst thing you could do is not do it.
I highly agree. Natalia, it's been great having you here. I know you're between banks of flights and you're going to have to get back to work here. I've been watching the clock, but you always are an inspiration to talk to at the air shows and here on the podcast. We definitely would love to have you come back on again, and love to see our co-host on your show, and Victoria Newell's talking about selling insurance and the challenges there, aviation insurance. So I think that would be a great person to have on. But the best place to find you find you on Spotify, wonderwomanofAviation.com or .wordpress.com. Again, we'll have links in the show notes to all of that. And I can't wait to hear some of the next episodes that come out and all those discussions there. Again, Natalia, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. This was fun. I learned a lot.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. If you're listening right now and you've listened to Natalia's story, do me a favor. Don't stop now. When you hit that stop button, just get out there and do something in aviation. Get out there, fly a plane, enjoy yourself, find out more about being a pilot, being a flight attendant, but more importantly, doing all those other things in aviation that Natalia talks about. No matter what it is, I hope you found inspiration from Natalia's story. And really another shout out to our sponsors here, the Spartan School of Aeronautics. You can find more about the free scholarships, guys, that they're giving away at stuckmicavcast.com/free. Use a coupon code Spartan. I love having people like Natalia on the podcast because it inspires me to do more. I hope she's inspired you to do more in aviation. We'll talk to you next episode. Safe flying out there.